Welcome back to the Zenith Poker podcast. Today we've got a few submissions for questions. So today it's just going to be just me, and I'll be answering some of the questions in the podcast chat, as well as a few emails being sent to me. So this first email that I got sent from Keith. G'day, Keith. He says, first and foremost, I want to thank you for your content. I think it is head and shoulders above the average strategy advice. I'm very new to poker. I started playing in August of 2020, but I study hard and enjoy the studying as much as the playing. I have an abundance of free time, as I have a cancer diagnosis. Poker has been a godsend though. I've been a member of Zenith for a while, working my way patiently through the material. I've taken several breaks to independently study topics, which I thought would increase my understanding, including a Yale Open course on game theory, a Khan Academy course on probability, and a refresher course in calculus. Sadly, although I was a math whiz in high school, but not a prodigy, I studied literature and philosophy in college and have forgotten nearly everything I once knew, as it was over 40 years ago. When it comes to poker, I don't really know anything. I'm a winning player, but I believe that is due more to luck than skill. I would like to have an idea what I'm doing, if only to identify what I am doing wrong. I am content, therefore, to continue my painstaking progress through the Zenith content. I like to understand something fully, if I can, before I move on. But I just watched your video on preflop ranges, and I wonder how I might access the Zenith ranges, and I also wonder if you have any advice about the best way for someone like me, your average adult, to study and implement these ranges. Obviously, I wouldn't be able to memorize them. I have GTO Plus, and I built a library of straightforward solves based on some of the corrupt ranges ridiculed in your video. I also just purchased a subscription to Gtox, which, although glitchy, has potential to be an extremely useful tool, I think. Any advice will be much appreciated. So thanks for sending this through, Keith. It's good to hear that you've been enjoying the stuff that I've been going through in Zenith. You started playing poker, almost a year ago, so you haven't been playing for too long. I'm sorry about your diagnosis of cancer. That's a very tough thing to go through. Me as a medical student, I see a lot of people with cancer, and it's always quite devastating to people. Very difficult process. Chemotherapy, radiotherapy, etc. Regression, relapse, all very difficult. So I'm sorry about that, Keith. But it's good that you've been enjoying playing some poker. I also see that you've been, studying up on your math, which is important. And I know it's been over 40 years since you've studied math. But the fact is, actually, the ability for you to do arithmetic in your head goes up as you get older. So I imagine you'd be in your 50s, 60s at this stage. So you're getting to the level where the arithmetic in your mind is going to be near its peak, much better than a lot of 20 and 30-year-olds, right? You can perform these calculations in your head much more easily because of your age, right? It's one of those things that people don't really realize. Their math and language skills continuously improve as they get older, particularly stuff like arithmetic and language in terms of vocabulary. So your arithmetic skills are probably very, very sharp compared to a lot of 20 and 30-year-olds. The math itself, the fact that you've gone through and did a bit of study up on the game theory and probability and calculus, like that's more than a lot of people have done. So congratulations, and I am very sort of proud that you've done something like that to improve your poker playing ability. In terms of your question, and your total progress, As long as you can go through the toy games in the Zenith Poker training, those toy games in the Foundations course, they're necessary to understand at least how the solutions kind of impact the ranges. And those particular solutions, the solutions to those games, you don't necessarily have to understand how those solutions come about. I mean, it's nice to understand that it has something to do with the equilibrium position. It's nice to understand how you can find the optimal bet size using a bit of calculus. But it's not super necessary. If you know how to do a bit of calculus, I'm sure you'll be able to figure out exactly what I'm saying when I optimize a bet size, right? In terms of what you need to do, you just need to study and try to understand what I'm trying to say and what the solutions to those toy games are trying to tell you. Those toy games themselves can lead to some spots in the actual game, right? The real no limit hold'em, which it shines lights on a lot of spots. If you understand all the toy games, then it'll be a lot easier for you to look at a GTO Plus solve or a Pio solve. I mean, you've got GTO Plus, so a GTO Plus solve, and understand why the solver is doing what it's doing, even at a base level. So that's why I recommend that every player who's starting out really understands these foundational toy games, right? And the reason why you're understanding them is not because their direct application will improve your game. The understanding of the toy games helps you understand what the solver is telling you. So for example, there's going to be spots where you're on the river and you're in position and you're making you're making a polar bet, and you want to understand the bluff to value ratio, right? The bluff to value ratio on the river is described quite nicely in the Ace King Queen games. The bet sizing on the river is described quite nicely in the Ace King Queen games, right? The bet sizing, the bluff to value ratio for these river bets can be modeled reasonably nicely with a toy game and be solved very quickly with a solver. A solver will solve a river in under a second most of the time. So understanding what the solver is saying on these rivers will help you play the rivers better, right? Understanding where the solver gets its bluff to value ratio, where the solver decides which of the bet sizes that you let it have, which of those bet sizes it likes the most, and why it likes those bet sizes the most, is really going to improve your game. And then there's other things that the toy games can help you with. Making polar bets across multiple streets, bluffing with a draw, calling with a range that's comprised mostly of draws, some of the check raise lines, protecting your checking range with the check raise, loads of spots, the give up lines, understanding why out of position tends to overfold on the flop in a lot of formations, and even some of the multi-way stuff. All of this can be found out by the toy games, and then your understanding of the toy games helps you understand what the output of the solver is telling you. And it also helps you understand where the solver might be going wrong. So solvers, they inherently, all they do is create an output for what you put in. So if you put in something that's wrong, you put in something that's inaccurate, incorrect, your output is going to be wrong, inaccurate, incorrect. So that's the reason why I would suggest a lot of beginning players to avoid running their own solves initially, because a lot of the time they'll be misleading themselves. The reason to buy the solvers as a beginning player is to look at and read and study solves that have been run already by stronger players. So Zenith is a great example of that. In the Zenith library, you can download a whole bunch of solves for free, and you can look at them free in GTA Plus or in Monk Viewer for the preflop solves. And what you're doing is you're studying a solve that was run by a strong player. And so a strong player, an experienced player, a player that's experienced with solvers and understands the game in more depth than you, will basically be able to create better game trees, better solutions than you will. So what you're doing is you're studying a good solution, a high accuracy solution of the game. And so your intuition that you train by studying will be more accurate. Now, this brings us along to studying. So what to study? Studying solves by other strong players is probably the best thing that you can do. And Zenith has loads of free solutions that you can study. And then if you've finished studying them, you can buy early access to the next set of solutions, right? So yeah, you've got loads of stuff. The next thing to do with your study, and in terms of how to study, is studying a variety of spots. So remember what I said about training your intuition? The game is an enormous game. So because the game is so big, there's so many different lines that people can take. Every hand is different, and it's probably never been played before. That the game is so big that every hand that you play most likely has never been played exactly the same way that you're about to play it. Okay? So once you understand that, you're not trying to memorize the game. You're training your intuition about the game. You can't memorize the game. The game is too big. Unlike in chess, where you can memorize a variety of openings, Go maybe, you can memorize a variety of openings. I mean, Go is enormous. Backgammon, you can remember the first few starting rolls, right? Those games are much smaller than poker. Poker is enormous. You can't memorize anything at all. So what you're really doing is you're training your intuition. And the best way to train your intuition is to look at a variety of different spots. So one thing that you can do is you can look at the preflop ranges. So studying a bit of preflop will definitely help you out. As a beginning player, just playing the correct hands, playing good ranges will cause you to win much more money, or at least cause you to not lose as much money as you otherwise would have played, right? Loads of money that beginning players lose is because they're playing the wrong hands before the flop. Just choosing the correct hands, having a good pre-flop intuition is going to take you very far in this game. Very, very far. Then after you study pre-flop, you move on to studying some post-flop spots, right? And remember, you're training your intuition, so you want to study a breadth rather than a depth. So you're studying a wide variety of spots rather than studying a single spot very deeply. So you'll spend a little bit of time studying the single raise pots, the heads up pots, 2-bet pots. You'll spend a bit of time studying heads up 3-bet pots, 6-max heads up pots. Sorry, 6-max 3-bet pots. I mean, you'll spend a bit of time studying the 4-bet pots, right? And there's a variety of different single raise pots, 3-bet pots, 4-bet pots that you can study. So for example, 2-bet pots between the big blind and the button. So the button's opened and the big blind is called, right? That's a very common spot, but it's very, very different to if the small blind calls. It's very, very different to if the cutoff opens and the button calls, right? So your intuition in one of those spots, in one of those 2-bet pots, is going to be very inaccurate if you try to apply those things that you've learnt to the other 2-bet pot. Even though they're both 2-bet pots, the stack to pot ratio is very similar. The ranges are very different. And because the ranges are very different, the dynamics are going to change. And because the dynamics are going to change, the strategy is going to change. And so studying one of them won't necessarily apply to the other ones. There's loads of different 3-bet pot configurations that you can look at as well. Common ones between the blinds, between button and blinds, between cutoff and button, and 4-bet pots similarly. You're looking at some of the squeeze pots as well, right? Squeeze 3-bet pots. So for example, the cutoff opens and the button calls, and then one of the blinds squeezes. Those two squeeze range from both the big blind and small blind are very similar. But the calling range also from the cutoff and the button are also very similar as well, except the cutoff's got pocket aces as a bit of a trap. So you can look at the subtle differences between the post-flop play when between the cutoff call and the button call of that squeeze. But there's loads of different spots you can look at. And then also studying some multi-way stuff, right? Hands are going to go multi-way into single raise pots a lot of the time. And your intuition from 2-bet pots heads up in 6-max is just not going to apply to 3-way 6-max, right? Or 4-way 6-max. You're going to have to fold a lot more multi-way. And that just comes back to the fundamental and foundational math in the toy games. It all applies to multi-way pots as well. So yeah, hopefully that helps. Going through the stuff on the website, the free training on the website, on the Zenith Poker website, is probably a good thing to start off with. There's lots of free videos. Downloading the simulations from the library will be able to help you out to start you off. And then if you want more solutions to look at, you can always buy early access. In terms of the subscription to Gtox, I'd be a bit wary there because Gtox, I know, doesn't have the best preflop ranges, and their postflop sims don't have a whole lot of bet sizes behind them. So it might be good to start you off to get you a bit of an overall understanding of the game very quickly, because if you can smack through a whole bunch of training hands very quickly, you can learn quite a bit about what's going on, or at least train yourself with a bit of intuition. But if you stick to it for too long, your intuition is going to be a little bit off compared to exactly what's happening if you study more accurate preflop ranges and postflop trees. Okay, so yeah, thanks for that question, Keith. Next up. Next up, we have a submission from Mark. G'day, Mark. Mark says, "Hi, Thomas. First of all, thank you for your content on the Zenith site and YouTube. It helps me a lot. I don't know where to start, but I need some help. That's why I ask you. Maybe you can point me in the right direction. I'm playing 25 NL Zoom, and for the first 70,000 hands, I was crushing them with a 10 big blind 100 hand win rate, but over the last 25,000 hands, I've lost. Cooler after cooler, set over set, aces, pocket aces getting crushed, kings running into aces multiple times per session. Not all the hands in the 25,000 hand sample were coolers, but some are tilting and some are bad plays. My blue line's been dropping from the point I've started to lose. I don't know what to do. I've lost 50% of my bankroll because I was taking some shots at 50 NL, which also went wrong. I've been studying hard every day, every time, but when I go to sit for a session, I lose. When the first cooler arrives, I start to steam. That's not good. I've lost my passion for the games, when to play. I've been studying your site and the Sims. I love to study, but I've lost the passion to play. I'm now studying the Sims from last year, but when I finish, I'll definitely buy the new ones. I don't know what to do, maybe you can give me some good advice, but it's frustrating. I've attached the graph so you can look at it yourself. Thanks for any support. And he's given me his graph to look at. So yeah, I mean, this graph, about 100,000 hands for the first, 70,000 hands or so, was crushing both the red line, the blue line. And now for the last 30,000 hands or so, his blue line's been dropping off, but his red line's still been going up. And because his blue line's been dropping off, his winnings has fallen as well. Over this 100,000 hands, he's been winning at a adjusted win rate of 6.21 BB per 100, and an overall dollar win rate of 4.3 BB per 100. Does it have the variance here? No. So, yeah, Mark, this graph looks really nice, right? What you're experiencing right now is the variance of the game. A lot of the time when you're winning at these very high win rates, especially as a beginner, you're winning at these very high win rates, it is just because of luck. So you're experiencing a downswing, and that downswing is mainly also the luck swinging against you. And this is going to happen, right? There's going to be loads of periods of time where you're just running bad. And then the running bad will compound if you tilt. So tilting as well will, when you're running bad, will cause you to play bad. The journey of a poker player, the skill of a poker player, doesn't necessarily come from how sharply they play when they're playing the best, right? It's how well they're playing when they're playing under emotional distress, right? When you're playing under emotional distress, right, either you should stop playing and clear your head, or you just need to be able to overcome those emotions and play in a logical way, right? It's important to remember that the deck doesn't owe you anything, right? And this might be a little bit confronting, but you're not owed anything. No one owes you anything in this game. The deck doesn't care who you are. The deck doesn't care what you did in the past. The deck doesn't care the number of people that you helped or scammed, or, how many cars you washed, or people you served, or burgers you flipped, right? The deck doesn't give a shit. So understand that the deck doesn't care about you, okay? And once you understand that the deck doesn't care about you, you'll also realize the deck doesn't care about your opponent either. The deck doesn't care about anyone. The deck's going to play out totally randomly. So when you really internalize that, you end up getting to a state where something bad happens to you, something good happens to you. It shouldn't affect your emotions. Getting to the state where the variance of this game doesn't affect your emotions is a long and difficult task, right? It's a long and difficult process to get to the state of being emotionally dampened, emotionally blunted, not responding to the variance. And it's easy enough, right, when you're starting out and you're running good, to not feel bad about getting outdrawn or cooled, right? But then when you start to have a bit of run bad, you start to doubt yourself. You're feeling, maybe I'm not a great player. Maybe something's out to get me. Maybe the deck is rigged against me. right? It's easy to feel these things. And then it's easy to look for signals in the noise, right? That try to confirm these beliefs. But all of it is random. It's all randomness. There's an enormous amount of randomness in the game. What you're experiencing now is that randomness. Over these past 20, 25,000 hands, 30,000 hands, what you've experienced is the RNG. So what's best from here is to forget what's happened in the past. Forget the previous hands. Forget all the hands that you played in the past and focus on the hand that you're going to play next. Stop looking at your bankroll. Focus on the hand that you're playing, the hand that you're about to play. Focus on playing that hand as best as you can. That's what you should be focusing on. If you're in an emotional state, you're frustrated by the RNG, you're frustrated by the cooler that happened 15, 20, 30, 40 hands ago, 100 hands ago, 1,000 hands ago, the way you got coolered 2, 3, 4 times yesterday, don't play. Because you're not going to be playing the best of your abilities, right? If you want to compete, you need to compete with a clear head. This is a game of skill with a luck component attached to it. If you're playing chess or backgammon or Go and you're emotional, you're thinking about how your girlfriend, boyfriend, mother's, father's, uncle's dog died, whatever, you're not going to be playing as well. The same thing applies to poker. The swing of the games, if you're letting that affect you emotionally, you're not going to be playing as well. And the combination of a swing of the game affecting your emotions, and then those emotions will cause you to play poorly. So often what happens to a lot of players is they start with a bit of a downswing, and then it compounds and snowballs into itself. Right? Because they start with a bit of a downswing and then they start to play poorly because of that. And because they start to play poorly, they've caused themselves to be put into worse spots and lose even more money. And then it compounds on itself even further, right? You end up snowballing and you get very emotional and you lose the passion to play. It's easy to have passion for this game when you're winning, right? But that's not where long-term passion comes from. You can't bring about a motivation to play this game from winning, because you're not going to win all the time. And because you're not going to win all the time, your motivation to play is not always going to be there. Your motivation to study is not always going to be there. Right? So really, you should look inward and find a different motivation to play the game. Make the motivation to play the game separate from whether you're winning or losing. Okay? Some of the motivations that very strong players have comes from playing the hand well rather than having won or lost the hand. It's one thing to go look back over your hand histories, over your databases, and look at all the hands that you've lost, right, to try and play them better. But not everyone goes and looks at all the hands that they won to try and play them better, right? It's very easy to overlook a mistake in a hand that you've won. But a lot of money is left on the table in your opponent's stack, which you could have in hands that you've won. You could have won more money by playing a hand a certain way than you did. It's very easy when you're losing to keep looking at the hands that you've lost. Maybe you played those hands perfectly and you got unlucky. Maybe the reason why you're losing is because you're not playing the hands that you've won as good as you can. The game is not just about winning your hand. The game is about beating your opponent, winning more of your opponent, winning the most amount that you can against your opponents. So when you're studying, when you're doing hand reviews, it's just as important to look at hands that you've won as well as hands that you've lost. You could be playing the hands that you've lost very well, but you've left money on the table in the hands that you've won. So, Mark, it's going to be a combination of variance. That variance being relatively new to you, because I assume you're a relatively new player playing 25NL. This variance happens. You can go for months and not realize you're a losing player. Go for months and not realize you're a winning player. Live players can play their entire life and not have the hand sample big enough to see that they're actually losing in EV, right? They could just be having run good for a decade because they're not playing enough hands per year. When you get online, you really see the variance because you're playing so many hands. You can go for stretches of thousands of hands where you've broken even and lost. Here you've got a 100,000 hand sample showing that you're winning at 6 big blinds, 100 hands adjusted, which is actually a really good win rate overall. So what I would recommend to you is do some inward looking. Think about the way that you look at the game and where you're getting your motivation from. Go back and look at some of the hands that you've won and see if you can find mistakes in the hands that you've won in your sample. And just keep studying and keep grinding, and don't play when you're feeling emotional or tilted. You can try to limit yourself by only playing an hour at a time, and then standing up and going for a break. Right? Clearing your head. Getting to the stage where if you get very emotional, just stand up and leave the table. Right? Stand up, get away from your computer, go outside, walk the dog or whatever, and then come back and then try again when you're feeling less emotional. So thanks for that submission, Mark. Okay, so next up, I'm going to try and answer some of the questions in the podcast chat in the Discord. So Sublime is good. Says, first podcast was great. I liked hearing about the guests' background, etc. when they were starting out. I was hoping you could go into more depth about your study regime split, what it looked like when you're starting out, especially how you first approach the Zenith material, how much time studying preflop, how much time studying sims, which one first, how much practice in the trainer, good studying methodology, various things, plug up leaks, trying to improve all parts somewhat simultaneously, but I'd like to hear from successful players, their study regime, what look like week to week and even now. Well, obviously I can't speak for Brandon or Josh, but my recommendations is going to be the same as what I said previously. Your study routine, you want to be studying a variety of spots. When you're starting out, you should be doing a lot more study than you're actually playing. Because the amount of information that you can absorb when you're beginning with your study of the solutions is going to be enormous. You're going to get a very high reward for studying than you will for playing. Starting out, you're beginning even against players that aren't thinking are drunk. If you're doing that at like 25NL, you're going to be winning what, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 big blinds per 100 hands. And how many hands do you play each hour? Maybe you play 200 hands per hour, so then you're winning 100. So you're playing 200 hands per hour, and if you're winning at 5 big blinds per 100 hands, that's 10 big blinds per hour. and 10 big blinds per hour at 25 NL is $2.50. Spending an hour to win $2.50 is not a great reward, right? Even in poorer countries, that's not usually the highest kind of level you would want to be earning at. A lot of people, when they're playing at these low levels, should be playing at those low levels just to practice the stuff that they've studied. So my recommendation as a beginner is to study at a ratio closer to 2 to 1, right? And it might be grueling to do that, but it's necessary for you to get good. Studying for 2 hours and then playing for 1 hour, right? In terms of how you study, that's entirely up to you. You can study using the trainer. You can study by training against a solution in GTA Plus. You can train against a solution in the Zenith preflop viewer. You can train against a solution. And then when you see yourself making a mistake, go and explore that mistake. Explore and try to figure out why that mistake was actually made. Or if you found a spot where you're just not sure, explore what's going on there. Because exploring what's going on, looking at similar lines, will help you hone that intuition, which at the end of the day, it's your intuition about the game that makes you a strong player, not the amount that you necessarily know or have memorized. There's always going to be another spot which you've never seen before, and your memory's not going to help you there. The only thing that's going to help you there is your intuition about the game. And if you can intuit, you can feel what the correct answer is or a good answer, you're going to be playing a lot better than your opponents will. And on average, you're going to win money against your opponents. So thanks for that question. Sublime is good. Okay, so another question. Gorilla's asked, when we look at a sim and come up with heuristic by ourselves, how do we determine if it's the real reason the solver does what it does? I feel like whenever the solver does, people always come up with a new reason to justify its play, even if it goes against previous known heuristics. So let's say, for example, the solver decides to check jam an unintuitive hand on the turn. By our intuition and a heuristic developed looking at other sims, we would think that this hand would always be a check fold. We come up with a new reason why the solver chooses this different action. How do we know if this new reason is actually correct or can be generalized to other situations, or our previous heuristics drive to this function, drive this check fold action were actually correct in the first place, or maybe the solver does this for a specific hand is so complicated there's no hope in finding a heuristic understandable by humans. It's usually going to be because your previous heuristic was a little bit wrong, right? Or at least doesn't fully encompass what's really going on in the entire game, right? There's going to be spots where you get these check jams that seem unintuitive, firstly, but when you look into the math and try to figure out where the EV is, and how the ranges were constructed, how that betting range was constructed, and the check jam range is constructed, you'll be able to figure out why the solver is choosing to do this check jam with this particular hand rather than check folding it if it would be a similar hand in a slightly different spot. And solvers are very, very sensitive to their inputs, especially when you get to sort of the turn of the river. Very, very sensitive to the inputs that you're putting in. So the check jam with these particular ranges on this particular turn and this particular run out might not be a check jam in a slightly different run out with slightly different stack to pot ratio, right? So because of that sensitivity in the solver, you're never going to be able to understand everything that the solver is doing all the time, because parts of what the solver could be doing really comes from the inputs. You could input a slightly different tree and it'll have a different outcome. So the solver is also trying to exploit its inputs as well, right? Not only is it trying it's trying to maximize its EV given the inputs that it's allowed, given the tree that it's allowed. So if you give it a slightly different tree, it might do something slightly different. And so you're not going to be able to develop a heuristic there, right? And these heuristics, right, should always be taken with a grain of salt. When you say heuristics, what do you mean? Maybe you're thinking about it as a list of rules that you're trying to write down to give you a good way to play. That's not usually the best way to approach the game, because the game is so broad. You can't write down a list of rules in terms of how to play it, because that list of rules is just not going to encompass everything that's going on. Maybe you can write yourself some little guidelines, right? A very basic way to play if you don't know what you're doing, to fall back on. But if your intuition isn't there, right, it feels unintuitive, if it feels that the solver is doing something unintuitive, then it's really your intuition that's wrong. So the reason why you're looking at these solver outputs is to train your intuition. So a lot of these lines where it seems unintuitive for a solver to do something, that's the spot that you should be looking at the most, because your intuition was wrong there. And remember, you're trying to train your intuition. So look at these spots where the solver is doing something that you deem to be unintuitive. How do you understand those spots a bit better? Look at the ranges. Look at the stack to pot ratio. Look at the lines that are similar. Look at the lines that weren't taken, and try to understand how the solver has come up with the EV of that action and the alternative actions that weren't taken. That's how you train an intuition. An intuition on the flop is going to be different to an intuition on the turn, which is going to be different to an intuition on the river. But the way that you play a flop should also be somewhat forward-looking. The way you play a turn should be somewhat forward-looking to the next streets. And similarly with preflop as well. You're always looking ahead, right? The way to play poker is similar to the way that you might think about a game like chess or Go or backgammon. You're still looking ahead. You're thinking about what might come next. And then you're using your intuition about that future spot to judge the current spot that you're in. So say, for example, you're at a position on the flop and you have to decide whether to bet or check, and you don't know what bet size to bet, right? The way that the solver does it is it looks at all the possible lines, all the possible turns and rivers, and then calculates backwards to the flop to estimate the EV. You should be doing it similarly, right? Obviously, you can't look at every single different run out. In each spot, there's going to be like, each flop spot, there's going to be like 2,000 different run outs. So you're never going to be able to think about all of them in the time that you have available to play the hand. But you can think about some of them. You can think about some of the lines that you might play on the turn of the river with this particular hand, right? Then if you're thinking about how you might be playing this particular hand across the turn of the river, it might help you think back to the flop. Or even just the flop play itself. If you've got a strong hand on the flop and you're thinking about whether or not to check it or bet it, you're thinking about what happens after you check. After I check, what does my opponent do? Does my opponent check back and we see a turn? How am I going to play that turn? If my opponent bets, what am I going to do against that bet? Am I going to raise? Am I going to call? Am I going to call and then we see a turn and then I check again on the turn and then I raise his turn bet? Right? You're thinking a bit about how you're going to play the hand, not just with the current decision, but also the future decisions that you might make. So you're doing a bit of forward thinking, and then you're applying the intuition from the forward thinking back to the current way that you're playing. And if you can forward think a bit, you can think about a little bit deeper into the game tree. That's where you can really apply good exploits to your opponents. The exploit that you might know against your opponent might only appear on the turn, but if you know that exploit, you can use that exploit to influence the way you play the flop and the way that you play pre-flop, because you're going to want to take lines which more likely lead to a good outcome against that particular opponent by taking that exploit that you found. So that's a bit of a tangent, but when you bring it back to looking at sims, you're building this intuition by looking at not just how the solver plays a flop, looking at the entire lines that the solver is taking with different hands. So one way that you can look at the flop post-flop solves is look at one hand or two hands and try to follow them across an entire line. Play a particular hand out all the way to the river and then see how that hand plays differently across different turns, right? So say, for example, use Ron to really work on the way that you play pocket aces across different flops, right? You can get really good at playing pocket aces by just looking at how it plays the different lines, different turns, the different rivers. And then you'll get really good at playing the flop with aces. You get really good at playing the flop and exploiting your opponents when you've got aces, because you will have studied the game tree, specifically looking at aces, and you'll understand where your opponents might be making mistakes against your hand. And so you can take better lines against these opponents with aces than you would by just spending less time on it. Obviously, that's a bit of a... Obviously, that's just an example. You want to be studying a variety of different hands so you understand how to play the game as a whole. You're not just always going to be dealt aces, right? So definitely do that sort of thing with a variety of different hands. And in real study, you're going to be looking at sort of hand classes. You're going to try and group those hands together in your mind and play them similarly. This, of course, is a bit of a simplification, but it's the way that you train an intuition about a spot. And as you get better and better, you'll get finer and finer grained intuition about different types of hands and be able to notice the subtle difference between certain suits, certain blockers, certain ranks, and then apply that to your own game. So study a bit of everything, train your intuition. When you find a spot that goes against your intuition, study that spot in more depth, because the goal is training your intuition, and you found something counterintuitive, unintuitive, study that, because studying that will train your intuition to be more in line with what's actually going on. So yeah, Gorilla, the answer is 2. Your previous heuristic was not correct in the first place. Okay, so that's probably all I wanted to go through today. Let me know if you have any comments or feedback about this format of podcast. I hope you guys all enjoyed. And if you have any questions, you can message me in the Discord, or if you have a question that you want to send to be reviewed on the next podcast, you can either send me an email or you can ask that question in the Discord itself. So thanks, guys, and you've been listening to the Zenith Poker Podcast. Bye now.